In less than 3 minutes, Whitney Houston would walk onto the field and deliver what many consider the greatest rendition of the American national anthem in history. January 27, 1991. Tampa Stadium, Florida. 90 million people watching on television. 73,000 in the stadium. But what those viewers didn't know, what the cameras never captured, was that just moments before taking that field, Whitney Houston was on her knees in a backstage bathroom, hyperventilating so severely that her security team thought she was having a heart attack. This wasn't just pre-show nerves. This was a woman caught between two impossible choices, trapped by a secret that threatened to destroy her career, and facing a threat from the one person who was supposed to protect her. What happened in those final 3 minutes before Whitney stepped into history would haunt her for the rest of her life. If you're ready to discover the untold story behind America's most iconic musical moment, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because what you're about to learn will forever change how you hear those legendary notes. The 1991 Super Bowl wasn't just another performance opportunity for Whitney Houston. It was happening during one of the most tense moments in American history. Operation Desert Storm had begun just 10 days earlier. The nation was at war, anxiety was everywhere, and security concerns were at an all-time high. The NFL had considered canceling the halftime show entirely, worried about potential threats. Whitney had been selected months earlier, long before the war began. At the time, it seemed like a triumphant moment, the perfect showcase for America's greatest voice during America's biggest sporting event. But as January approached and the situation in the Middle East escalated, everything changed. The performance was moved from halftime to pregame. The stakes were raised impossibly high. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was about national unity, patriotism, and giving a frightened country something to believe in. Whitney's vocal coach, Gary Katona, later revealed the immense pressure she was under during rehearsals. She kept saying she had to get it perfect. Not good, not great, but absolutely perfect. She knew millions of Americans would be watching, including soldiers preparing to go into combat. She felt like she was carrying the weight of the entire nation on her shoulders. But there was another layer of pressure that nobody in Whitney's professional circle knew about. Her marriage to Bobby Brown was already showing serious cracks, though the public still saw them as a glamorous power couple. Behind closed doors, the relationship had become volatile, controlling, and increasingly frightening. Bobby's jealousy about Whitney's career success had intensified, and he had developed a pattern of undermining her confidence before major performances. In the weeks leading up to the Super Bowl, Whitney had discovered she was pregnant. It was early, just 6 weeks, and she hadn't planned to tell anyone until after the performance. But somehow Bobby had found out, and he was furious that she hadn't told him immediately. The pregnancy added another layer of anxiety to an already overwhelming situation. Whitney was experiencing severe morning sickness, exhaustion, and hormonal changes that made emotional regulation even more difficult. Her assistant, Robin Crawford, was one of the few people who knew what Whitney was dealing with. She later recalled that Whitney barely slept in the week before the Super Bowl. She was worried about the performance, worried about the pregnancy, and increasingly worried about how Bobby would react to her success. It was like watching someone try to hold together multiple lives that were all threatening to fall apart simultaneously. The morning of January 27th started badly. Whitney woke up in her Tampa hotel room feeling nauseous and emotionally fragile. She had spent the night reviewing the arrangement over and over, terrified of forgetting words or missing notes. At breakfast, she couldn't eat anything, which concerned her vocal coach. A singer needs fuel, especially for a performance requiring that much power and control. Then, around 10 in the morning, Bobby showed up at her hotel room unannounced. He wasn't supposed to be there. Whitney had specifically asked him to stay in New Jersey, telling him she needed to focus. But Bobby had flown down anyway, and he wasn't alone. He had brought several friends, and by the time they arrived at Whitney's suite, they were already intoxicated. The confrontation that followed would set in motion the crisis that nearly destroyed the most important performance of Whitney's career. What happened in that hotel room remains one of the most closely guarded secrets in music history. Only a handful of people were present, and most have never spoken publicly about it. But through interviews conducted years later with people close to Whitney, a disturbing picture emerged of the psychological warfare she endured just hours before stepping onto that field. Bobby was angry about multiple things. He was angry that Whitney had kept the pregnancy from him. He was angry that she had asked him not to come to Tampa. But most of all, he was angry about a tabloid story that had just hit newsstands that morning, suggesting that Whitney's marriage was strained and that she was seen frequently with Robin Crawford in what the article implied were romantic situations. The article wasn't true, but it touched on Bobby's deepest insecurity about Whitney's relationship with Robin. His jealousy of Robin had been building for months, and now, fueled by alcohol and surrounded by friends who encouraged his worst impulses, he unleashed years of resentment on Whitney just hours before the biggest moment of her career. According to sources close to the situation, Bobby told Whitney that if she went through with the performance looking like she was happy and successful while their marriage was falling apart, he would hold a press conference that afternoon and reveal intimate details about their relationship. He threatened to discuss her private life, her friendship with Robin, and details about the pregnancy that Whitney desperately wanted to keep private. The threat was calculated and cruel. Bobby knew that Whitney's wholesome, all-American image was central to her brand. Any scandal, especially one involving her marriage or questions about her sexuality, could devastate her career. And he knew that Whitney, already anxious about the performance, would be especially vulnerable to this kind of psychological manipulation. Whitney's security team, who were in the adjoining suite, heard the confrontation escalating and intervened. Bobby and his friends were escorted out of the hotel, but the damage was done. Whitney was left emotionally shattered just hours before she was supposed to represent American strength and unity to 90 million viewers. Robin found her sitting on the bathroom floor, crying so hard she could barely breathe. The morning sickness combined with the emotional trauma had left Whitney physically and mentally depleted. For the next hour, Robin and Whitney's vocal coach worked to calm her down. They tried to get her to eat something, to rest, to focus on the technical aspects of the performance rather than the emotional turmoil. But Whitney kept saying the same thing over and over. "I can't do this. I'm not strong enough. He's going to destroy everything no matter what I do." The woman who was supposed to inspire a nation in 3 hours couldn't even stand up without help. By early afternoon, Whitney's team was genuinely worried that she might have to cancel. Her voice, when she tried to warm up, was shaky and weak. The pregnancy nausea was relentless, and the panic attacks kept coming in waves, leaving her gasping and disoriented. This wasn't just nerves. This was a complete emotional and physical breakdown happening at the worst possible moment. At 2 in the afternoon, with the performance scheduled for 6:30, Whitney's manager made a desperate call to Sissy Houston, Whitney's mother. Sissy was in New Jersey, not planning to attend the Super Bowl because she didn't like flying. But when she heard the state her daughter was in, she immediately understood the severity of the situation. The conversation between Whitney and Sissy that afternoon was recorded accidentally because the hotel phone Whitney used was on a system that archived all calls for security purposes. Years later, portions of that conversation were shared with Whitney's biographer, revealing the raw vulnerability of a daughter reaching out to her mother in absolute desperation. Whitney's voice on the recording is barely recognizable. She sounds young, frightened, and completely overwhelmed. "Mama, I can't do this. I don't have anything left. You took everything from me this morning." Sissy's response was not what Whitney expected. Instead of sympathy or permission to cancel, Sissy did what she had always done. She reminded Whitney that Houston women don't quit, don't show weakness, and don't let men determine their destiny. "You listen to me, baby. That man doesn't own your voice. God gave you that voice, and you're going to get yourself together, and you're going to sing for those people. You're going to sing for those soldiers. And you're going to show Bobby Brown and everyone else that nobody, and I mean nobody, can take away what God gave you." The conversation lasted 17 minutes. Sissy didn't coddle Whitney. She didn't tell her it was okay to be falling apart. Instead, she did something that was both harsh and necessary. She reminded Whitney of every obstacle she had overcome to get to this moment. The racism in the music industry, the criticism that she wasn't black enough, the jealousy from other artists, the constant pressure to be perfect. "You've survived all of that," Sissy said, "and you're going to survive this too." But there was one moment in the conversation where Sissy's tough exterior cracked slightly. When Whitney told her mother about the pregnancy and about Bobby's threats to expose private details of her life, Sissy was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was different. Softer, but somehow even more intense. "Baby, you're carrying a child now. That child is going to need a mother who doesn't let anyone make her feel small. You go out there today and you show that baby that her mama is strong. You show that baby that nobody breaks a Houston woman. That conversation marked a turning point. Whitney's tears stopped. Her breathing stabilized. And something shifted in her demeanor. The fear was still there, but it was being pushed aside by something stronger. Determination mixed with defiance. If Bobby thought he could destroy her, she would prove him wrong. If the pressure threatened to crush her, she would rise above it. And if America needed strength, she would find it somewhere deep inside herself and deliver it. By 5 in the afternoon, Whitney was at Tampa Stadium going through final preparations. The arrangement had been pre-recorded, a common practice for performances in stadiums where live singing would be impossible to hear properly. Whitney would sing live, but the broadcast would use the recorded track to ensure audio quality. This decision, which would later spark controversy, actually gave Whitney one less thing to worry about during those final hours. But as the clock ticked closer to performance time, Whitney's anxiety returned with a vengeance. The stadium was filling with fans. The television production team was running through final checks. And somewhere out there, Bobby Brown was watching, waiting to see if Whitney would crack under pressure or rise above it. The weight of all those eyes, all those expectations, all those unspoken threats was becoming unbearable. Ricky Minor, Whitney's musical director, noticed that she was becoming increasingly agitated during the final sound check. She kept asking to run through the arrangement one more time, then one more time after that. She was searching for perfection, but really she was stalling, trying to delay the moment when she would have to walk onto that field and face everything she was terrified of facing. At 6 o'clock, 30 minutes before the performance, Whitney told her team she needed a moment alone. She walked to a private bathroom in the stadium's backstage area, locked the door, and that's when the final, most severe panic attack hit. Her heart was racing so fast she thought she was dying. Her vision became blurry. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and she couldn't catch her breath no matter how hard she tried. Whitney later described this moment to her closest friends as the lowest point of her entire career. She was on the floor of that bathroom, her beautiful outfit getting dirty, her carefully styled hair falling apart, and all she could think was that she was about to fail in front of the entire world. The pregnancy hormones, the lack of sleep, the emotional trauma from Bobby's threats, and the overwhelming pressure of the moment had finally broken through her defenses. Her security guard, stationed outside the bathroom, heard her gasping and immediately called for help. Robin and Whitney's assistant rushed in to find her curled up against the wall, hyperventilating and sobbing. This wasn't something they could fix with encouraging words or breathing exercises. Whitney was having a complete breakdown, and the performance was scheduled to begin in 25 minutes. The next few minutes were frantic. Someone called for a medic. Someone else tried to reach Sissy on the phone. Whitney's makeup artist rushed in to assess the damage to her appearance. But Whitney herself seemed almost disconnected from the chaos around her. She kept whispering the same thing over and over. "I can't breathe. I can't sing. I can't do this." The confidence that Sissy had tried to instill just hours earlier had evaporated completely. It was Robin who finally cut through the panic. She cleared everyone else out of the bathroom, knelt down in front of Whitney, and did something that shocked everyone who witnessed it. She grabbed Whitney's face firmly, forced eye contact, and said something that nobody else heard. Whatever those words were, they had an immediate effect. Whitney's breathing started to slow. Her eyes focused, and after several long moments, she nodded. What happened in the final 15 minutes before Whitney walked onto that field remains something of a mystery. The people who were there have described it as almost supernatural, a transformation so complete and so rapid that it defied logical explanation. One moment, Whitney was a broken woman on a bathroom floor. The next, she was straightening her outfit, fixing her hair, and walking toward the tunnel with the posture and presence of someone absolutely certain of her purpose. Ricky Minor, waiting near the field entrance, couldn't believe what he was seeing. When Whitney had gone to that bathroom, she looked defeated. When she emerged, she looked fierce. The fear was still there. He could see it in her eyes, but it had been joined by something else. Anger, perhaps, or determination, or maybe just the decision that she would not let this moment be defined by Bobby Brown or panic attacks or any of the things that had tried to break her that day. As Whitney walked through the tunnel toward the field, she did something she had never done before a performance. She started talking to herself out loud. The people walking with her could hear her giving herself a pep talk, a stream of consciousness monologue that seemed to be part prayer, part affirmation, and part defiance. You're Whitney Houston. You were born to sing. Nobody can take your voice. Nobody can make you small. You're about to show 90 million people what strength looks like. The moment she stepped onto that field, something remarkable happened. The crowd's energy seemed to physically hit her like a wave. 73,000 people, most wearing red, white, and blue, many holding signs supporting the troops overseas, all focused on her. The national television cameras captured her face as she absorbed the scene, and for viewers at home, Whitney looked absolutely confident and composed. Nobody watching had any idea of the crisis that had unfolded just minutes before. But if you look closely at the footage from those final moments before she began singing, you can see tiny details that tell a different story. Whitney's hands are trembling slightly as she holds the microphone. Her jaw is tight, not from confidence, but from tension. And just before the music starts, she closes her eyes and takes 3 very deep breaths, the kind of breathing pattern someone uses to fight back panic. The opening notes of the national anthem began, and Whitney, the woman who 15 minutes earlier couldn't breathe, couldn't stand, couldn't imagine surviving the next hour, opened her mouth and delivered the first line with such power, such clarity, such absolute perfection that the entire stadium seemed to collectively hold its breath. "Oh, say can you see, by the dawn's early light." Every word was perfect. Every note was precisely where it needed to be. This wasn't just good singing. This was transcendent artistry born from absolute desperation. Watching Whitney's performance of the national anthem at the 1991 Super Bowl is watching someone channel every ounce of pain, fear, and anger into something beautiful. Music historians and vocal experts have analyzed this performance for decades, trying to understand what made it so extraordinarily powerful. The technical aspects were flawless, but that wasn't what moved people. It was the emotion underneath every note, the sense that this wasn't just a performance, but a declaration of survival. What nobody in that audience or watching on television knew was that Whitney was singing through continued waves of panic. Between phrases, when she would pause for breath, the anxiety would surge back. Her heart was still racing. Her hands were still shaking. But she had made a decision in that bathroom, or perhaps Robin had made it for her, that she would complete this performance no matter what it cost her. The moment that broke her, and nearly broke millions of viewers, came during the line, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air. Whitney's voice soared on those words with such intensity that it felt like she was singing not just about historical battles, but about her own internal war. The bombs bursting in her own life. The explosions of her failing marriage, her compromised privacy, and her desperate attempt to maintain control when everything was falling apart. By the time Whitney reached the climactic final line, "O'er the land of the free and the home of the brave," she wasn't just singing words. She was making a statement. She was claiming her own freedom from the man who had threatened her that morning. She was proving her own bravery by standing there despite wanting to run. And she was showing America, and more importantly showing herself, that she was unbreakable. When the final note ended, there was a split second of absolute silence before the stadium exploded with sound. 73,000 people erupting in applause and tears. Fighter jets flying overhead in a carefully choreographed tribute. And Whitney, standing in the center of that field, finally allowed herself to breathe. The panic that had controlled her for hours suddenly released its grip. She had done it. She had survived the impossible and created something that would outlive everyone present that day. The television broadcast captured Whitney's face immediately after she finished singing. For just a moment, her mask slipped. You can see raw relief mixed with exhaustion. Her eyes were wet with tears she was fighting to hold back. And if you watch very carefully, you can see her mouth the words, "Thank you, God," before she remembered to smile for the cameras. What happened immediately after Whitney left that field is crucial to understanding the full story of that day. While America celebrated her triumph, Whitney was backstage experiencing a delayed physical and emotional crash. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance was wearing off, leaving her shaking and nauseous. She made it to her dressing room before her legs gave out completely. Robin, who had stayed with her throughout the day, later described finding Whitney sitting on the floor again. This time not from panic, but from sheer exhaustion. She had given everything she had to that performance, and there was nothing left. The pregnancy, the lack of sleep, the emotional trauma, and the physical demands of singing at that level had depleted her completely. She looked at Robin and said something that revealed the true cost of that perfect performance. "I did it, but I don't think I can ever do anything like that again." Bobby Brown showed up at the dressing room about 20 minutes after the performance, acting as though nothing had happened that morning. He was smiling, celebrating, taking credit for being the supportive husband. But according to witnesses, Whitney refused to even look at him. The success of the performance had given her a clarity she hadn't had before. She realized that she had achieved that moment not because of Bobby, but despite him. And that realization would be the beginning of the end of their marriage, though it would take many more years for her to find the strength to leave. The immediate aftermath was also complicated by the media response. While millions praised Whitney's rendition as the greatest version of the national anthem ever performed, some critics questioned whether she had actually sung live. The decision to use the pre-recorded track became controversial, with some people suggesting Whitney had lip-synced. These accusations, though technically inaccurate since Whitney did sing live, even though the broadcast used a studio track, wounded her deeply. Whitney felt that after everything she had been through that day, after fighting through panic attacks and threats and physical illness to deliver that performance, people were still finding ways to diminish her achievement. It reinforced a pattern that would haunt her for years. Nothing she did was ever quite good enough. Every success came with criticism. Every moment of strength was questioned or attacked. In the weeks following the Super Bowl, Whitney's recording of the national anthem became a phenomenon. It was released as a single, with proceeds going to support troops and their families. It reached the top 20 on the Billboard charts, an almost unprecedented achievement for a national anthem. But Whitney's relationship with the performance remained complicated. She was proud of what she had accomplished, but she couldn't separate it from the trauma of that day. 6 days after the Super Bowl performance, Whitney received a phone call that she never discussed publicly, but that several people close to her later confirmed. It was from a military spouse whose husband was serving in the Gulf. The woman told Whitney that her husband had called from overseas after watching the Super Bowl broadcast. He told his wife that hearing Whitney sing the national anthem had given him strength he didn't know he needed. It reminded him what he was fighting for. It made him feel connected to home, and it helped him get through some of the darkest, most frightening moments of his deployment. That phone call affected Whitney more deeply than any praise from music critics or industry professionals. She realized that her performance, born from her own desperation and pain, had somehow reached across thousands of miles to touch someone else who was also afraid and fighting to survive. It gave meaning to the suffering she had endured that day. Her pain had been transformed into something that helped someone else carry theirs. Whitney kept a recording of that phone call. Years later, when she was struggling with addiction and depression, Robin would sometimes play it for her as a reminder of her power to affect people's lives. "You turned your worst day into someone else's best moment," Robin would tell her. "That's who you are. That's what you do." The message didn't always break through Whitney's darkness, but on the days when it did, it gave her a reason to keep fighting. The legacy of Whitney's 1991 Super Bowl performance extends far beyond music. It became a cultural touchstone, replayed during every national crisis, every moment when Americans needed to feel unified and strong. After September 11th, 2001, radio stations across the country played Whitney's version of the national anthem. When she died in 2012, it was the recording that dominated memorial tributes. And to this day, it remains the standard against which every other rendition is measured. But for those who knew what Whitney endured to deliver that performance, the recording carries additional weight. Every powerful note represents a victory over panic. Every moment of control represents a triumph over chaos. And every second of that perfect performance represents 3 minutes when Whitney Houston, despite being broken and terrified and under attack, chose to rise above everything trying to destroy her and gave the world something transcendent. In the final years of her life, Whitney spoke more openly about the pressure she had faced throughout her career. She talked about the impossible standards, the constant criticism, and the way success brought its own form of isolation and pain. But she rarely discussed the specific events of that Super Bowl day. It was too personal, too raw, and perhaps too revealing of the private struggles she had worked so hard to hide. However, in a 2009 interview that received little attention at the time, Whitney made a comment that those close to her understood as a reference to that day. She said, "Sometimes your greatest strength comes from your darkest moment. Sometimes you have to break completely before you can understand what you're really made of. I've had moments where I thought I couldn't go on, but somehow I found a way. That's not because I'm special. It's because we all have more inside us than we think we do." The people who were in that Tampa Stadium bathroom who saw Whitney at her absolute lowest understand the profound truth of those words. Whitney Houston didn't deliver that legendary performance because she was superhuman or immune to suffering. She delivered it because she was deeply human, deeply wounded, and somehow found the strength to transform her pain into beauty. That's not just impressive artistry. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Today, when we listen to Whitney's Super Bowl performance, we're hearing more than just perfect notes and powerful vocals. We're hearing 3 minutes and 43 seconds of someone refusing to let the worst moments of their life define them. We're hearing a woman choosing strength over surrender, art over anger, and grace over giving up. And we're being reminded that sometimes our most beautiful moments are born from our most broken ones.